When people lay claim to convictions about what there exists or what kind of place the world is, on the basis of something they've inherited, that is something that they were taught in childhood, or something that makes them feel comfortable to believe, or something that gives them a particular orientation to the world that makes sense to them because of their early experience, or when they claim to do this on the basis of faith, where by faith they mean something conformable with the tradition of faith, that is the idea that you accept something as true even if the evidence goes against it being true. You may have to remember there are lots of examples of heroes of the faith who said, "It is so absurd that I believe it," or Søren Kierkegaard saying, you take a leap even if all the indications should push you in the contrary direction. And this is what it is to have faith. To be a hero of the faith is somebody who will accept something despite everything. And you may remember that in the Gospels themselves, we are presented with the example of doubting Thomas, who wouldn't believe until he saw with his own eyes and pushed his fingers into the wound in the side of Christ. And Jesus said to him, "Well, blessed are those who believe but who haven't seen." You may remember. So this makes a virtue. And in fact, it is one of the three cardinal virtues of Christianity, along with hope and charity: faith. Having faith, believing despite everything that you hear, that it is a virtue. And of course it isn't, it's an intellectual crime. And when you think of it in those terms, when you see it as an intellectual crime, you see why there is this ethical dimension to proportioning the beliefs that you have, the conclusions that you reach, to the evidence that you have for them. And this involves, when you begin to unpack this idea of a kind of rationality, an ethics of inquiry, when you begin to unpack it, you find that a lot of things follow. You'll be familiar, I expect, with the view that Popper put to the effect that if nothing whatever counts as counter-evidence to some hypothesis, that the hypothesis is empty, unless it is something that can be tested, unless you can specify things that would constitute a crucial test of some claim, some supposition, that the claim or the supposition really lacks content. And this is a very important principle, I think, or entails an important principle about inquiry, namely that anything whatever that you're going to accept, any proposition you're going to accept responsibly, will be one which submits to test, or that can be made to fit with other things that themselves can be submitted to test. And this introduces a really rather interesting point. Very often you get people saying, you can't prove that God doesn't exist. You can't prove that there are no deities or supernatural beings in the universe. And of course this is an ignorant claim. You can prove it. Not in the sense in which you prove a conclusion in a deductive argument. So in deductive logic or in mathematics, for example, conclusions that you reach are always implicit in the premises. Or if you look at a deductive calculus, and you notice that conclusions of deductions are merely rearrangements of the premises. They're all of them instances of begging the question from the point of view of their form. And that's not what proof is in the contingent case or the empirical case, where you're conducting scientific investigations, let us say, or historical investigations. There, proof means, the English word proof means testing. So you prove a certain kind of metal alloy, let's say, as to how much of a load it can bear by increasing loads on it until it fractures. And this is conducting a proof, or proving the metal, conducting a test to find out what its properties are and what it will bear. And so in the contingent case, you can prove things. That is, you can test things. And you can test them rigorously and vigorously and see whether thinking about them one way rather than another really stands up to that kind of scrutiny. But this is very, very familiar in the natural sciences. Because then when we talk about science, of course, you've got to remember there are lots of different kinds of science, some of which admit of laboratory experimentation, others of which require field work and observation and accumulation of data. So the sorts of things that you might do in fundamental particle physics, for example, at CERN, might be rather different from what you might do in doing geology, let's say, when you're doing field explorations. But in all those cases, you are conducting inquiry according to the canons of good scientific method. That is, putting forward hypotheses, testing them, looking for the evidence, weighing and evaluating the evidence, rejecting what the evidence goes against, or changing the parameters of your inquiry, and so on, in order to behave intelligently with respect to what it is you're trying to find out about. It may very well be, you may remember T.S. Eliot's remark that there is no method other than to be intelligent. It is to be really thoughtful and try and bring together all the relevant considerations that bear on something. And that is precisely what science is. Science is just applied intelligence. It's just trying to do things in as rigorous and careful a way as possible and not jumping to conclusions. And in particular, not saying that when you don't understand something or the results come out the wrong way or there's a gap or we've created more difficulties than we had before, more problems than before we had solved a given problem, that we just reach out and appeal to something arbitrary. I call it the Fred move. We don't understand something, we don't know how the world began, then you just say, well, Fred did it. Or Fred, if you don't like the name Fred, what about another name? God. Okay, God did it. Okay, so just some arbitrary would-be closure to a chain of inquiry or a chain of purported explanations by invoking something which in fact, of course, is much less well understood and inaccessible to test. There's a very, very big difference implied, therefore, by the scientific mindset, by the ethics of inquiry, which is that you're prepared to live with open-endedness and with uncertainty and with doubt and with having to do more work and recognize that there are more problems and trying to find ways to assay them, to weigh and explore them. And that mindset is very different from a mindset which, of course, is very natural to human beings, which is the mindset of the narrative, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, closure, a nice, neat story, an explanation. We know where we came from, why we're here, and where we're going. And usually those narratives about the origin of the world and the duty of man and what's going to happen at the end times and so on, tends to be explainable in about half an hour. And it usually takes a bit more than that to understand biology or physics. So you can see that the two mindsets are dramatically different. And the part of the drama of their difference lies in the fact that quite different ethics govern their proceeding. So in the case of scientific inquiry, most broadly understood, the ethics of inquiry says you don't accept a proposition unless you've got evidence for it, unless it can be tested and has been tested. Whereas in the other story, the ethics is don't think, accept, believe, just have faith. In fact, it's a virtue not to think about it, but to have faith and to accept it on trust. So these are dramatically different ways of thinking about things. And when you take a couple of steps back and you ask yourself, what are my intellectual responsibilities here in thinking about the world and in orientating my intellectual attitude to the world? And that is an invitation to reflect on the ethics of rationality, of how you should inquire, what you can accept, and how to proportion your evidence to your beliefs. But when you think in those terms, you see that, broadly speaking, the scientific endeavor is the one which conforms to the demand that the ethics of rationality makes in a way in which accepting a religious outlook, a religious belief or doctrine or set of dogma does not. It is, from the point of view of the ethics of rationality, unethical to accept a religious view of the world and richly ethical to accept the obligations imposed by the ethics of rationality. And the very, very significant point here lies in the etymology of the word rationality. The first part of the word, ratio, means proportion. To proportion the evidence that you have, the grounds you have, to what you commit yourself to or what you believe, is precisely what it is to be rational. Bertrand Russell, of course, said, and it's a quotation you're very familiar with, it's not what I believe, but why I believe it that really matters, the grounds that I have for believing something. It's the case I can make, the evidence I can adduce, the inquiry that will substantiate committing myself to such and such a view, always, of course, under government of the acceptance that all our thinking, when we think according to the ethics of rationality, is defeasible. We might be shown to be wrong. New evidence might come up. And if we have intellectual integrity, we change our minds accordingly, or we adjust our beliefs accordingly. So this is quite a demanding and quite an austere set of claims that the ethics of rationality impose upon us, set of obligations to think responsibly, and to be, in the right kind of way, skeptical always. Skeptical in the sense that, presented with something, we want to test it, we want the evidence, and we want to proportion our acceptance or rejection to that evidence. So it seems to me that when you look at the sorts of reasons that people might have for being religious, accepting a religious view of the world, accepting a set of traditions or doctrines or dogmas, and sustaining those beliefs, sustaining that practice when they come to the age of reflection, the age of intellectual maturity, that by the lights of the ethics of rationality, they are not being ethical in that sense. So I used to think that being an atheist just meant, was a sort of a negative situation which implied nothing else. But I've now come to think that it really does imply something. It implies an intellectual choice, and a grounded one. And this connects with something very important in the other sense of ethical. Because as you know, since you were all reading Plato's Dialogues in the bath last night, that Socrates' great great remark was, the unconsidered life is not worth living. The life not thought about, not reflected on, not chosen by the person living it, not informed by the best consideration that we can give about how to live given our own capacities and talents, what sorts of things are worth valuing and worth pursuing. That if one doesn't do that, then one's life is the product of other people's choices. One is a football in somebody else's football match. A very topical reference, that one. And therefore, one would have failed in an important duty, indeed in a duty not just in the general ethical sense, but in the sense of the ethics of rationality, to be the best that one can be by reflecting on oneself and making those sorts of choices.